All right, good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started with our presentation here. Just a quick introduction here for a few seconds here. My name's Lance Wood. I retired 2 weeks ago, but I still feel like I'm part of the National Weather Service Houston Galveston office. I was a science and operations officer there for about 16 years, and in the area since I actually grew up in Houston, so I've been in the area since the 70s. So we'll start off here. I want to acknowledge Robbie Berg, who is the warning coordination meteorologist at the National Hurricane Center. He actually provided some nice graphics about the season last year, and we're going to go over some of those today in our lessons learned as well. So starting off here on this title slide, we have a satellite imagery, infrared imagery of Hurricane Beryl making landfall near Matagorda with maximum sustained winds of 90 miles per hour, making it a pretty strong Category 1 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale. And one of the things that I wanted to point out that was very interesting at looking at Beryl after the fact is that the pressure actually dropped a little bit after landfall, which isn't that typical. And the lowest pressure actually happened about 40 minutes after landfall. And so we believe that Beryl actually strengthened a few hours after landfall, or at least maintained that intensity. Part of the reason why we saw so much strong winds in the Houston area was Beryl was trying to intensify there right at landfall and maybe just after. So before we talk about the season of last year, and this was mentioned in the previous section, the prologue is the Houston Metro derecho. So just yesterday, 1 year ago, we had this significant windstorm. Derecho is a Spanish word that means straight line winds. It was coined in the late 1800s by a professor in the central United States after a windstorm in Iowa. But it's a long-lived storm that produces severe winds, and it can affect usually several states, that kind of length. And the one that happened in the Houston metro area kind of started just to the west and then migrated all along the northern Gulf Coast. It's the most significant non-hurricane windstorm since May 1983, when approximately about 10 people died. So from this particular derecho, 8 people died in the Houston area, 3 from falling trees. The power was out to about 1 million people, and most people got their power within about a week. But this was on the minds of people even ahead of Beryl, that they had already gone through basically a disaster here, a wind disaster in the Houston metro area. And if you look at that slide behind me where you see the blues and pinks and the reds, those are the wind speeds as the storm was approaching Houston. And those pinks, we actually changed the color scale to show this. Those pink colors are 100-mile-per-hour winds that the radar was sampling. So we actually had a pretty nice look at it into the radar. So we had a good estimate of the wind speeds as it approached Houston. And part of the reason why the office issued a destructive severe thunderstorm warning, and what's different about that is the expectation of winds more than 80 miles per hour, and that actually activates your phone, whereas a regular severe thunderstorm warning does not. So one other slide I want to talk about with post-derecho is we had this partnership with the Houston Health Department, and we were getting near real-time heat illness data versus weather. And so the derecho comes in on the 16th, if you look at this slide, and the gray area is your heat index, the gray line is your heat index. So you see when it rained with the storm, the heat index was low, but right after it, the heat index started to rise. It generally was around 100 in the days after the derecho, which is below our normal heat advisory criteria. But considering that we had power outages to the metro area, we saw a spike of heat illness, and we hadn't in the past actually seen this data pretty real time. And this sort of surprised us a little bit that we were getting that much heat illness with the temperatures that we saw that May. But so that was kind of already on our minds when we dealt with the post-Beryl conditions. And part of the reason we were so proactive with issuing heat advisories and also lowering our criteria for those advisory was because of the data we had seen after the derecho. So this really points to partnerships mattering, to do a really good job of messaging the dangers of heat. Well, let's zoom out a little bit and let's look at the whole season from 2024. What actually happened last year? Well, it was above normal year, 18 named storms, well above normal with 11 hurricanes and the 5 major hurricanes. 10 hurricane landfalls. Yeah, that is fairly remarkable, with 5 of them along the U.S. Gulf Coast, and you can see the Gulf was very busy. That tied the record for the second most on record. Another really big story was 358 fatalities in the United States last year, and this is why we go back and look at what happened last year so that we can learn from it, because that is a lot of fatalities on this day and age with the considering the messaging capability and the forecast capability that we have today. So this is a little bit lighter look at the Hurricane Saffir-Simpson wind scale. So the meteorologists like to say Category 1, Category 2, so our Cat 1, Cat 2. So you can see the wind speeds going up there on our cats as we go from Category 1 to Category 5. And just to give you some reference on this scale, it is significant when you go up from one category to the next, because the force of the wind and the damage that's going to happen is proportional to the square of the wind speed. So it's not a linear thing. It goes up significantly from one category to the next. So Beryl is strong Category 1 with the 90 mile per hour. Ike, some of you may remember Ike was a Category 2. A little bit more wind damage, obviously, with Ike, and Ike was a larger storm. But the size of the storm is not really factored into this wind scale. It's just what is the maximum intensity, and that's what you get. We consider a major hurricane when it's Category 3 or greater. And so I'll be referring to a major hurricane, so just kind of remember that means Category 3, 4, or 5 on this particular scale. So it's been busy in the Gulf, right? So take a look at what's been happening since 2017 in the Gulf of Mexico with major hurricanes, those Category 3s or greater, making landfall. Well, of course, in this region, we experienced the rainfall from Harvey, but the lower coast, mid-coast, saw the actual wind impacts of a major hurricane in 2017. Since then, we've just seen more and more major hurricanes making landfall. So it's been a really, really active year, especially if you consider an active several years, especially when you consider that between 1963 and 2016, we didn't have this many making landfall in the United States. So we have seen an uptick in our major hurricane making landfall, and a big uptick. So how are people dying from tropical cyclones? This is another thing we study after every season. We study it in periods of time. If you look between 1963 and 2012, more than 3/4 of the fatalities are due to water. If you look at the period from 2013 to 2023, it's still water. It's a little bit different in that the storm surge was a higher percentage, before 2012, and now the inland rainfall is the higher percentage, but it's still water. And the reasons for that is really a couple of storms. So Katrina caused a lot of storm surge deaths in 2000 and in the mid-2000s there, and so that's why the storm surge deaths are higher in that period. And then, of course, we had Harvey producing a lot of rainfall deaths inland in 2017. But the main takeaway from this is most of the time with our tropical cyclones, water is the main issue. This is not as well understood as our indirect fatalities. This can happen, before, during, or after the tropical cyclone. A lot of times it's actually after because of a power outage. You might have, say, hyperthermia. That's your heat illness that you see on the bottom. But with power outages, we also have carbon monoxide poisoning. That's a possibility from poor ventilated generators. We can have medical equipment that is no longer working because of a power outage. The physical stress, the mental stress of a tropical cyclone can cause a cardiovascular event, an incident. And so we have cardiac failure as a big one as an indirect fatality. So we count both of these, the direct fatalities that come from wind, water, tornadoes, and then we also count these indirect that happen because of other things happening with our tropical cyclone. So after Beryl, we had heat advisories for a week. We trimmed them back a little bit as the power came on, but I think it was one of the first times that in the products, the Weather Service actually stated the reason we're issuing this advisory is because of the lack of air conditioning and people doing strenuous cleanup activities. So it's really important to give people the why if you're doing something that's a little bit different maybe from what you normally do. So normally we'd be looking for that heat index to be more in the, say, 105 to 110 range. We weren't quite reaching that in a lot of days in the post-Beryl, but we knew it was dangerous, and we knew it was dangerous from the derecho, and we actually had more power outages after Beryl than the derecho. And so that post-heat deadly being after Beryl, we actually had more indirect deaths with Beryl than direct deaths. That's fairly significant. And we also know that indirect deaths with heat often go underreported. So we know about the 14, there actually could have been more. So it's been a focus here at the Hurricane Center and at the National Weather Service. Can we do a little bit better with post-storm heat messaging? Maybe we need to message it a little bit earlier, right? Since we have so many people that this is an issue, a vulnerable population that can be exposed here when there's a heat event after a power outage. So one thing that's going to happen in 2025 is there's going to be a better advertisement here of post-storm heat risk. And so the National Hurricane Center, if they believe we're in an event where we can have, a power outage situation because of the strong winds, are going to start advertising the heat risk even before the storm makes landfall this year. And I think this will be a really big plus to start highlighting this heat threat that we saw actually with Beryl as well. So what else did we learn from the 2024 season? As I showed you earlier, it was busy, right? And we had major hurricanes making landfall along the Gulf Coast again. Well, as I showed you with the direct deaths historically, water is still the main villain when you look around the United States and all these landfalls, and unfortunately, who lost their lives. We still have to keep that in mind, and I probably don't have to remind you of that with Harvey back in 2017 taking more people with water than wind as well. So specifically, water, and again, we're just adding it up. The freshwater flooding from rainfall, the storm surge, rip currents, marine incidents was responsible for almost 60% of the deaths in the United States. And then if you actually look outside the United States, it was 83%. And 12 of the 13 storms that caused direct deaths had one fatality attributed to freshwater flooding. You see some pictures there. Of course, you know about the flash flooding with Helene, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But also happened there in Acapulco with John last year in the Pacific, the East Pacific. So we're actually doing a pretty good job with these rainfall forecasts. I know some of y'all remember the 3 feet or 4 feet that was advertised of rainfall ahead of Harvey. Similar situation here, not quite the rainfall amounts, but a big area being covered by 15 to 20 inches of rain, and that's basically what we saw. One of the differences here is you're dealing with terrain, mountainous terrain, where you have rapid runoff. So this is a very dangerous forecast when you start to see 15 and 20 inches of rain that far inland in a mountainous terrain situation. And much like what happened in Harvey, and some of this was learning from Harvey, as communities need to prepare for catastrophic, life-threatening inland flooding well after the landfall. This message was being put out pre-landfall. So this was a pretty significant move by NOAA and the National Weather Service to put out a press release ahead of landfall highlighting this inland flooding threat. So they had actually identified this threat really, really well. But unfortunately, you can't actually stop the flash flooding. You can only tell people, to try to get ready for it. So Helene, unfortunately, was a storm that really highlighted all threats you get from tropical cyclones, because we also had a significant storm surge from a major hurricane that was moving fairly quickly. I wanted to point you out, though, on this storm surge forecast down the coast there in the Tampa Bay region. It's not actually the maximum storm surge where you see more further north there into Apalachicola Bay area where, a very significant storm surge is being forecast. But all the known 9 fatalities that we had with storm surge all occurred in the populated region that saw a significant surge, not in the more unpopulated regions. So I know your eyes will sometimes get drawn to these maximum, where's the worst going to be? But remember, anywhere you have more than 3 or 4 feet of inundating storm surge, it's a dangerous situation. So if a storm surge warning is issued, as you see in red on the one graphic there, all along the Florida coast, that whole coast has a dangerous situation. And we saw that with the 9 fatalities there near the Tampa Bay region. So this is going to hit home here a little bit more, that the lesson of wind gusts matter. And there's a couple of hurricanes from last year that really highlight this particular threat. Again, let's start with Hurricane Helene, because it was such a significant tropical cyclone for the United States. Notice that we had We had tornado fatalities that you see with the circles on there. We had storm surge fatalities where you see the blue dots. We had wind fatalities, quite a few wind fatalities where you see the red stars. And then we had the flash flood fatalities there in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee with the flash flooding. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of wind fatalities there all along the track once inland. And it was a fast-moving storm also interacting with terrain. And if you take a look at the wind gusts from Helene, you can see hurricane-force wind gusts well into North Carolina. Now think about how far inland that is, that we were seeing those kind of wind gusts. So a very gusty hurricane. Some of the peak winds there, even in Georgia, were around 100 on the wind gusts. Augusta, 82, and then in the mountains, even higher. So one of the most prolific inland wind producers with wind gusts that we've seen with a hurricane. Well, now let's enter Hurricane Beryl from July 8th, 2024. Another very gusty hurricane. And when I looked at Beryl compared to Ike, for example, on the wind gust, Beryl was gustier. Now, the winds weren't necessarily stronger, but it was a gustier hurricane. So when you look at the Southeast Texas region, there was a lot of Southeast Texas getting, sustained winds and the strong tropical storm force, 50 to 60 inland. But there were many locations getting 80-plus miles per hour wind gusts. So we put out warnings for sustained wind speeds, not necessarily gusts. And so this, I think, actually surprised some people because here we are getting, well into the Category 1 category with 84, 83 mile per hour wind gusts in the eyewall region. As you see Beryl tracking across Houston there, that northeast eyewall region is bringing those hurricane-force wind gusts. But technically, you're in a tropical storm because we're measuring against the sustained wind. So we need to do a better job, I think, as a meteorological community, advertising the gust potential of our hurricanes. And so I, as a science person, was working with a team at the National Hurricane Center that has been looking at generating some probabilistic guidance in a new version of the probability model that can actually give us more gust information. And so after the fact, we went and ran Beryl. And if we had this information, I think it would have been great to show what the chances of were, at least in this area, of seeing hurricane-force wind gusts. So if you take a look at what kind of products we could have been showing with some new technology here, on that Sunday morning advisory, once the track had shifted a little bit more towards Houston, so think about 24 hours before getting the wind speeds, we could have been saying, there's a 40 to 50% chance that at least some of the Houston metro area was going to see hurricane-force wind gusts. And if you look at it in a worst-case scenario, what we call a 10% exceedance, that's the big red color that you see on there, that's saying, okay, what should I prepare for type of a thing? What's the realistic worst case? Well, you can see there's a large area in red of hurricane-force wind gusts showing up when you show sort of a worst case scenario from the model. So I'm looking forward to this helping us out down the road and better advertising wind gusts, which is really what do all the damage when we have these tropical cyclones. So a few updates. I already talked about the heat risk product being used for the post-storm heat risk, but the inland watches and warnings on the cone graphic, and I think in the previous session this was talked about. We're doing a better job advertising the watch and warnings inland on the cone graphic, and we've also updated the issuance criteria for potential tropical cyclones. So those cyclones that could form but haven't, we're going to put those out a little bit earlier. So that's two of the main ones here. So, and during Beryl, we hadn't quite transitioned to this experimental version. So you didn't see those watches and warnings inland like you do in the legacy product. So this is using Helene, and you can see with Helene it was very valuable to show those watches and warnings further inland with a fast-moving major hurricane. And I think the experimental version there really paid off for those folks in the Southeast United States, getting a little bit more notification on that main product that we use to communicate the track and where it's going. You also get those watch and warnings inland. So look for that next year, even if something affects us here early in the year. And then up to 72 hours, so that's 3 days, we could be issuing advisories even before something has formed. So that's giving us an extra day potentially of notification of something that's forming, say, in the Southern Gulf or Northwest Caribbean. So in other words, the tropical cyclone hasn't quite gotten its act together, but the expectation is it will. So the forecast goes out 3 days ahead. So I think more notification is always a good thing. So that's a really good change. All right, so let's talk about the seasonal activity here for this coming year. So I wanted to start off with, let's take a look at what we call the main development region of the tropical Atlantic. So this is where most of our tropical cyclones end up beginning. So how warm is it? Well, so the reds are the warmer, the yellows are above normal. If you take a look at June 1st last year, it's a record year for warmth. And part of the reason why we had such an aggressive forecast and the number of storms last year. You take a look at just a few days ago here, May 11th, and this year it's above normal, as you can see, with more yellows and a little bit of orange in there, but not as warm as last year. So above normal water temperatures, but not quite what we had last year is the takeaway from this particular slide. And then we also look at what's going on with the tropical Pacific, what's happening in the El Nino, La Nina cycle. And I know this is kind of a fundamental thing to meteorologists, but not so much for everybody else that wonders what we're doing here. But basically, since the ocean and the atmosphere are coupled, what happens in the tropical Pacific can affect the wind shear over the tropical Atlantic. So we have been coming out of a La Nina. We're now into a neutral phase. That's the gray bars. We think we'll stay in a neutral, which is not really above or below normal water in the Pacific. And what ends up happening is if you are either below normal water in the Pacific with the La Nina condition or the neutral condition, you don't end up with a lot of wind shear over the tropical Atlantic. So neutral or La Nina is a positive for development in the Atlantic. So the only thing that could slow down our season if we got an unexpected El Nino to develop, which produces more wind shear across the tropics, but that threat looks low. It looks like more like a 10 to 20% chance of having El Nino develop. So we're planning to get ENSO neutral or possibly a La Nina in the peak of the season in the summer and the fall. So these are the two main drivers for the Colorado State University forecast, which is the one I like to use this time of year before NOAA's hurricane forecast comes out, and usually looks pretty similar, to tell you the truth. So this looks a little bit like last year, not quite as active as the forecast. It's an above normal forecast with 17 named storms, 9 hurricanes, 4 major hurricanes, and you can see the average for the last 30 years being 14, 7, and 3. And again, this is based on the fact that our La Nina is transitioning to neutral. We're already in neutral, but we're expected to stay in neutral. And then the sea surface temperatures are warmer than normal. So because of the lower wind shear and the warmer water in the tropical Atlantic, that is a conducive environment, unfortunately, for hurricane formation intensification. So that's the reason for the above normal forecast. And I think you will see NOAA also have an above normal forecast this year as well. They'll put a range on the numbers, but that's likely to be what the forecast will be. That 17 will likely be in the center of the range. Now, Matt Lanza mentioned this in the previous panel, that it only takes one. And I actually usually show this slide in a hurricane preparedness talk because the first storm of the year, 1983, was an August storm named Alicia. I was 14 years old in Sharpstown. I helped my dad scramble to get the plywood up on the windows because we weren't as good at forecasting tropical cyclones in 1983. And Alicia formed off the Louisiana coast, and we didn't have much time. I remember barely getting the plywood up, and the winds were coming up. And so that actually got me interested in meteorology because I heard limbs hitting the boards, and I wondered, this is interesting. I've never seen anything like this. And then I was up when the eye went over Sharpstown and saw the calmness of the eye and then got the other side of the eye wall. So it's a memorable hurricane for me, and it should be a memorable hurricane for you as well because, look, there's only 4 named storms that year, and one of them hit Houston. And it's actually our last Category 3 or greater hurricane, so it's the last really big windstorm that we've had as well, where winds were over 120 miles per hour in parts of the metro area. So it's really important that you use the seasonal forecast as, to get ready. Think about the season's coming. The tropical outlook's already out there by the hurricane season. That started a couple of days ago. They start that in mid-May to sort of get you ready as well. But remember, it only takes one, and we always prepare like that. So what do our names look like for 2025? Well, we're going to start off with Andrea. Dexter actually replaces Dorian. I was actually at the Hurricane Center during Dorian, helping them out. When I think of Dexter, I think of the Showtime series with the good guy serial killer. So let's hope Dexter doesn't come with a knife this year. We're going to hope that doesn't happen. Another interesting, some other names I see on here: Imelda, the big rainfall producer, Humberto, right 1 year exactly before Ike, that made landfall here. Jerry and Chantal, 1989 hurricanes. And Jerry was the latest hurricane on record, October 15th in 1989. So that's usually the last time that we can actually get a tropical a hurricane would be mid-October, because we cool down about that time. So let's hope we don't get as very deep into these names, but we have to prepare like we may see one of them. And finally, my last slide, I just want to remind everybody how you can connect to the National Weather Service, the local office being weather.gov/Houston, and the National Hurricane Center website, hurricanes.gov. I know for a fact there's a hurricane and severe weather guide there on the Houston website. You can download that. You can get the latest information on making that hurricane plan that was talked about in the previous session. This is the time of year to have a plan, get your supplies together, figure out if you're in a storm surge risk zone, or do you have enough supplies to if you are going to stay, to handle a power outage. Those are the kind of things you want to be thinking about. And then you see the social media links there too on the bottom of the slide. Well, with that, I will wrap up, and I really want to thank you for attending, and I appreciate you coming here, number one, and then number two, getting this information about last year. I really think it's really important to learn, constantly be a lifelong learner, and it's served me well to always look at what's just happened and try to figure out how we can do better. And as a science and operations person for 16 years, that was my main job. How can I always get better and learn from what just happened, and then leverage the best science that we've got out there? So we are doing that. We're going to continue to do that, but we need everybody out there in the public to also prepare and be aware of what's happening and be ready to use all the products that are out there now to make some informed decisions. So with that, again, I'll wrap up, and I'm glad to see you here, that you're getting prepared, and I hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.